you, Harold. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It was kind of at short notice. The background is, I think in May this year, AHEAD invited me to an interview, and it was a written interview, and I don't know what happened to that interview, but we'll find out afterwards. So Harold got it wrong. It's a carbon currency, but it's not a carbon credit, and I'll explain. So I'm going to talk about the carbon reward, and I'm going to cover just an introduction to the whole project, the climate problem. I'll explain the new financial mechanism. At the end, I'll go over politics, because everybody's interested in that, implementation, and if we have time, I'll discuss the new systems model. Let's see how we go, because I don't know how long this will take. And also, obviously I don't speak German, so if there's anything you don't understand, just put your hand up and interrupt. Don't be shy. Introduction. Okay, as it was stated earlier, The Ministry for the Future is a science fiction novel. The author found my work, a publication from around 2017, 2018, and he liked the idea, so he included it in his science fiction plot. He calls it Carboni, or carbon coin. Carbon coin invokes the idea of a cryptocurrency, but this is not a crypto. I reviewed the manuscript for Stan and helped him, with the technical details. And it's a surprisingly popular book. What is the carbon reward? Well, it's a new international policy for resolving the market failure and meeting the Paris goals. So market failure is an economic term, meaning the markets have failed us. They're not really working because there's too much pollution. This policy is unique because it addresses the global systemic risks with carrots. What do I mean by carrots? Conditional grants, money in effect, without debt. It's unique because it combines market and monetary financing. Market being, pricing like the emissions trading scheme, carbon pricing, combined with monetary policy, which, involves central banks. So that's unusual. It expands on neoclassical economics. It offers improved ecosystem protection, and it avoids carbon offsetting. So this reward is not a carbon credit, and for that reason it can be confusing. The goal for the Paris Agreement is to stay well below 2 degrees and hopefully to 1.5. Very unlikely we'll stay under 1.5. It's almost a given now we're going to exceed that in, say, 10 or 15 years with massive consequences for the biosphere. To get to the point, this carbon currency, it's going to be given a name, XCC or something like that, and the unit of account, what it's measuring, is 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. Oh look, there's a laser pointer. Yes, it works. But it doesn't work on a screen, so I won't try to make it work. But equivalent, meaning all greenhouse gases, and strategically mitigated. This is kind of a new phrase that implies it's going to focus on actions that really have a big impact on the global carbon budget. Not just any kind of technology or action, but really significant actions. And mitigation for 100 years or more, the time is important. So if you avoid emissions or if you take carbon out the atmosphere, it's got to be effective for at least 100 years or longer. And there are a lot of details. So the most important function of this carbon currency, it's to allow the reallocation of financial capital on a global scale. And this is an idea that might not be obvious at first. It's saying that when investors and the public and financial institutions, banks or whoever, are trading this currency as an investment. It has the benefit of reallocating financial capital around the world to effectively to pay for the mitigation, or most of it. This currency is called a commodity-linked currency, and XEC is the proposed code. And this code and this currency is analogous to XAU, XAG, XPT, and XPD. Maybe you've never heard of those, but they're actual kind of like commodity currencies that are traded in the foreign exchange. XAU. Does anyone know what AU stands for? Not Australia, it stands for gold. That's the chemical element AU, gold. I'm not sure how it translates to German, but AG is silver, PT platinum, PD palladium, the precious metals. So it's not a medium of exchange. You don't use this to buy food or coffee or commodities or anything. It's not allowed. It's not a carbon credit. And you know, the carbon credit market, that's a relatively new market. There's regulated and there's voluntary. And you know how companies buy these credits to offset their emissions? That's a big feature. Well, this will never do that. You can't offset. And that's really important because it takes some of the risk out of the whole problem, because we don't want offsetting. It's a zero-sum game. It's not a security or a cryptocurrency. They're technical points. Okay, so this is a new image. What's going on here? I just wanted to explain that when we create this carbon currency, you got to have demand for it. And I thought I'd use the analogy of a rope. So imagine the rope, the length represents how much carbon currency we create. And if there's demand, it's like people pulling on the rope. Demand meaning people want to buy it. And the tension in the rope is metaphorical for the price. So a lot of tension, a high price, because a lot of demand. So when you think about it, we want demand, don't we? Because if we have demand, there's a high price, and then it pays for everything, pays for the mitigation. So in this policy, we're saying the central banks are going to be buying, creating demand, and then everyone else will too. The financial institutions, corporates and public, anyone who wants to invest in it will create demand, and that creates the tension in the rope and the price. Now if we create more XCC, this carbon currency, we got a longer rope, and that reduces the tension. So you need to have a good balance. Okay. This project, it's actually 10 years old, really. It goes back to 2014. Historically, just by coincidence, the very first writing I ever did on this policy was in Firth, in the back of my friend's Mercedes. We're driving out to a party, and I was just starting to think about this and typing in it. And that was actually 2013. And then I went to Central America, to Costa Rica, and I traveled through Central America to Mexico. And over the Christmas to the New Year, I then launched the policy in 2014 with a couple people, an American and a Dutch economist. And since then, it's been in ideation for about 6 years. I launched the policy properly in 2021 as the Global Carbon Reward. And the policy working paper has just recently came out. Well, this year it came out for review. And the ideas now, I think, are fairly complete. There's a lot of new thinking has gone into this policy, new economic theory, systems analysis, a lot of technical details in mitigation. It's complicated stuff. The hope is then to demonstrate. That will take 2 or 3 years. So we're calling for partners and sponsors to demonstrate this new policy. It's been featured in some conferences and magazines, the Wall Street Journal. I've presented at a number of universities, both physically and online, and it's getting pretty good reception. I don't think anybody's found a hole in it, you know, a big problem. An economist at Bar College actually did what you might say is an expert review. His name's Ian Goodstein. You can check it on our website. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time to talk about the climate problem. And do you have the boiling frogs story? It's a cultural meme. This story is applicable to us in the climate problem. We're like the frogs in the boiling pot, so that it's getting warmer and hotter gradually, so you don't notice so much. And this frog saying, we need an extra 3 trillion per year of target investing and a new model for global governance, you know, to do with climate. Actually, you'd say maybe even more than 3 trillion per year, up to 8 trillion possibly. And then the frogs, which are us, are saying, oh, let's do more carbon offsetting. What about green growth? But these ideas just aren't working. You could put in their degrowth too if you want. That probably won't work either. And so we're now seeing some quite dramatic changes in the Earth's climate. You would know that last year was a record year. There's a sudden increase in global average temperatures and also a fairly rapid increase in intense fires, forest fires. This year is even hotter than last year. This pink denotes the warming, or the temperature of this year relative to last year. So it's even hotter. And 22nd of July was the hottest day recorded that we know of in, I guess, the history of humanity, maybe going back thousands or tens of thousands of years. So that's where we are. And not only is the planet warming quickly, climate scientists know that the Earth system has tipping elements, meaning that there are subsystems in the global climate, such as the Amazon, such as the permafrost in the Arctic region. There's circulation patterns in the Atlantic Ocean and other systems or subsystems of the climate that are fairly stable, but at some point they'll become unstable and non-linear, potentially creating feedbacks into the climate change effect. If these tipping elements were to become destabilized, the impacts could be dramatic. I don't think anyone really knows what the actual impacts could be. It could be much worse than what the IPCC reports say. And we don't have models to tell us reliably or accurately when they're going to tip, how much they're going to tip. It's unknown because it's a complex system and it's somewhat chaotic. Therefore, we're dealing with a lot of risk, and this topic deserves its own presentation, really. I'm not an expert in this, but if you read up about it, you can find out on the internet. One last thing I'll say about tipping elements. Coral reefs in the tropics, they're more or less going to be destroyed by coral bleaching, which is an effect that's going to be very dramatic at around 1.5 degrees. So carbon offsets are risky. I don't know in Germany if you talk about carbon offsets a lot, but certainly in the mainstream media it's been a big topic because journalists who've dug into these offsets and done some analysis have come to the conclusion that most of them don't look reliable. And the problem is you have polluters in one location continuing to pollute on the basis that they're buying offsets, carbon credits from somewhere else. But if those carbon credits or offsets are not reliable, then you're really creating a bigger problem. And so, as you can imagine, we need to sort of break out of this offsetting mentality. The climate finance gap is a very important measure of the climate problem. So the amount of money that is needed to try and reach 1.5 degrees of the Paris goal is a lot based on various studies. And so estimates of how much money is missing globally is roughly 3 trillion to as much as 8 trillion per year of additional money. It's called the climate finance gap. Actual investment historically is increasing, and in 2021-22 it was 1.3 trillion. So 1.3 trillion means 1,300 billion, right? However, not only do we have this finance gap, we also have a lot of debt accumulating in the world economy, over 300 trillion in debt since 2022, more than 3 times global GDP. So a lot of debt means that countries and businesses could potentially face major financial disruption. And for poorer countries, it means if you're in debt, you might need to force austerity on the population to pay down debt, which is very problematic. Also, in the future, we're going to have climate inflation, meaning rising prices because of climate impacts on food and water and energy and buildings and so on. So that's the problem. It's looking pretty grim. The new financial mechanism, we just need to explain the supply and the demand. So in this side of the screen is the supply, and on the other side is the demand. And so we need a new institution. The Ministry for the Future novel calls it the Ministry for the Future, but I call it the Carbon Exchange Authority, and it issues the carbon currency. Projects that want the currency as a reward for mitigation, they have to sign contracts that are issued by the Exchange Authority. And this authority will be set up probably under the UN as a big institution. Now, this process of assets being contracts and liabilities being this carbon currency might be foreign to many people, but it's actually very similar to the way banks work. So commercial banks that lend money, you know, when you need a mortgage or borrow for whatever reason, you go to the bank and you sign a contract, a loan contract. That's the bank's asset, and then they will issue new euros if it's a European bank. Here, this is an international authority. It will take contracts that are signed by projects and issue the currency to the awardees. I hope that's coming through clearly. So that's the supply, and the demand. We just need to make sure that the world wants to buy this carbon currency. Meaning the world, I mean all the actors in the foreign exchange market. That's the market where currencies are traded, because that's where we're going to create demand. Now, it's a big market. It's the biggest in the world, highly liquid. It's trading 3 trillion every 24 hours on average. So if these people and businesses buy it, then we're good. However, they need a reason to buy it, and the reason is provided by the central banks. In this policy, all the major central banks will provide a guarantee that they're promising to buy it into the future at a certain price. And it's this guarantee that influences everybody's perception of the carbon currency and its future value. So if the future value is going to be higher, it's attractive to buy. Now, when they buy it, they're going to create more national currency as their liability, and then they'll put the carbon currency on their balance sheet as an asset. I can explain that in more detail if you like, but I'll just keep going because it might not be so important at this point. Here, I'm going to talk about the global carbon budget, so you can get a feel for what we're trying to do with this new policy. So this graph is referring to the world's future emissions. We're at 2024, roughly here. And as you can see, global emissions are around 59 gigatons per year. CO2 is about 36 of that. And Under current policies, the future looks something like that, heading to about 2.5 degrees. And so to stay at 1.5, we'd have to avoid all of this, the conventional mitigation, in other words. It's kind of like a light blue colour. Now, not only do we need to avoid that, we also need to take this out of the atmosphere, because even if we avoid all that, it won't be sufficient. You'd still have to take some out of the atmosphere to achieve the result for 1.5 or close to that. So our policy, this new policy, what it's going to do, it's actually going to fund the carbon removal and storage. So I'll just explain that again. CO2 removal and storage means taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, the ambient atmosphere, and storing it somewhere or somehow. And this policy is going to fund that. And it'll have an explicit price. So that's really important, because currently there are no policies or ideas out there for how to pay for that. Keeping in mind, that's a lot, right? 20 gigatons is a huge amount, and it's going to be expensive. You're talking at least $1 trillion a year. The other channel or opportunity with this policy is reward channel 2 for the conventional mitigation. And the difference here is that it's much more flexible. That's going to be very specific, explicit pricing, and this is customized. Customized, why? Because all the different sectors of the economy have very specific technologies and industries, and it's complex. So to deal with all that complexity, we're going to offer carbon rewards, or carbon currency, using very customized rules and agreements. That's all. Flexible. And finally, the other thing this policy can do is offer reward adjustments to incentivize virtuous investing in mitigation. Virtuous meaning doing the good things, and more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. So community well-being, ecosystem health and protection, and energy reliability. So if these projects do a good job, they can get more, and the projects that do a bad job, they'll lose some of their rewards. And I'm just going to now focus in on what the policy is going to do to pay for this removal and storage, because that's really a very important concept, and it structures this whole policy. Okay, so just think, we need to take all of this out of the atmosphere. It's a lot, up to 20 gigatons, even more possibly. How do we do it? Well, this price chart is not for the carbon currency. This is the price of gold. And I thought I'd show you this price chart for gold because, as you can see, it's been rising for 30, 50 years. And did you know that the price has been rising a lot lately because central banks have been buying gold, like China, India, Brazil, I think. And I just wanted to illustrate that if we got all the central banks to cooperate and coordinate on buying gold, you'd expect the price to rise, true? And that's what we're going to do for this carbon currency. So this is an example, an analogy. But the actual price that we want for the carbon currency is not like the gold price. It's going to look like the blue line here, because this blue line is actually calibrated to the amount of mitigation we need. It's sort of the right price for this amount, so we hit the target. Now, if the central banks guarantee that blue line, then the actual price can rise above that, just under natural forces of supply demand as everybody's trading the carbon currency. So they're called the spot prices. Okay, and it'll be advertised, so the whole world will know what the price floor is into the future. We'll tell everybody. So if we're in the year 2025, we have an idea of what it's going to be for 100 years rolling forward. And that's why That's why businesses and financial institutions, pension funds, investors will buy it because they know it's going to rise under the guarantee. Okay, so that's the concept. That's how we force the whole policy to work. And how are we going here? Oh yeah. Now, this might not be so easy to understand at first, but you would ask the question, if the price was too low because there's not enough buyers, say the spot price fell below the floor, what happens? Well, that's when the central banks buy. Okay, so these green bars are hypothetical periods of central bank purchases to make sure the price stays at least to that floor. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. It's an incentive for the central banks to do this? They're going to be told to do it under a policy. It's a mandate for them. That the governments have to agree to this for it to work. That's essential. Okay, there are central banks, as I said, they're doing this purchases. It's called quantitative easing. In this case, it's called carbon quantitative easing, and it's a long-term form of quantitative easing. I just wanted to explain again what I mean by carbon dioxide removal. It's literally taking carbon out of the atmosphere, which isn't easy. It's in very low concentration, so it's expensive. Obviously plants can do it, trees do naturally, but making sure they store it isn't so easy because the amount of carbon that land retains is a function of rainfall, climate, a lot of variables, soil, biology, and so on. So what we're going to do is open up this market globally to all kinds of solutions. And now keep in mind, as I said earlier, the cost is around $1 trillion a year, in that range. So the idea of offering this reward is a very powerful concept because the policy can actually fully fund this work, be they engineered solutions, natural or hybrid methods, whether it's on land or in the ocean. And with this long-term price signal, it will encourage investors and entrepreneurs to put a lot of money into research and development. Okay, because currently we don't really know how to do this at a large scale. So once the price signal is created, the big advantage of this policy is that the whole world will be aware that if somebody comes up with a new technology that's really effective, there's a lot of money to be made. So it'll create a kind of a gold rush for carbon. And that's important because that's how we lower the price over the long term. And that's the concept behind it. A lot of people complain currently or say, look, we don't know how to do this now. Can we really rely on this? In my thinking, it's really just a thermodynamic problem. It's not that we don't know how to do it, it's expensive because the thermodynamics are unfavourable. But there's a lot of potential to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere using algae and marine methods and so on. We just need to invest a lot in it to make it work. Energy asset exchanges. This is a really big idea. This is one of the reasons this policy can make a huge impact on the world economy, on the energy transition. You might call it the Energiewende here, but a global Energiewende. So the concept is that we currently, or the world currently, is planning to extract more than double the amount of fossil fuels that's allowed for 1.5 degrees, and maybe 70% excess of what's allowed for 2 degrees. So we have this problem that fossil fuel companies, nation states, they're extracting because they need or want the revenue, the profit. So what we're going to do in this policy, with the carbon currency, we're going to be able to buy those fossil fuels at a reasonable price under the condition that the owners of those fossil fuel leases, be they coal, oil or gas, they'll leave it in the ground. They won't extract it. And so in this policy, what's unique is that we'll say, okay, we'll buy the fossil fuels, you leave it in the ground, but you also have to build renewables with this finance. Okay, so that's why it's called an energy asset exchange. You're exchanging fossil fuels for renewables, and it's this contract that will accelerate the decarbonisation of the global energy system. Okay, this is actually mentioned in the novel. Another advantage of this approach is that the carbon currency, another reason it's special is that it's debt-free finance. It's a conditional grant, so it's not a loan. And for countries that have relatively low income, that are developing, they're very desperate for revenue in international markets. That's why they extract natural resources and sell it. But these developing countries, a lot of them really struggle because when they need financial capital, when they need money, and they try to borrow in international markets, they're often hit with very high interest charges because of sovereign risk. And so here we help to alleviate that problem because the carbon currency or carbon reward is debt-free. Not only is it debt-free, when they earn it for keeping fossil fuels in the ground, that carbon currency is valuable in international markets, and it's as good as a hard currency. It's even better because it's got that price floor. That means they've got reliable funding and they can use it to borrow more, and it'll just help them out immensely. The other advantage of the policy, because it has this top-down approach with offering rewards, we can use the policy to coordinate supply chains and better manage the energy transition at the global level, making sure demand for renewables matches supply, because you're introducing new technologies like green hydrogen, green ammonia, batteries, or whatever, and you need to be able to supply the energy at the right times in the right places. We can also use this policy to protect biodiversity in communities in a number of ways. I mentioned earlier the reward adjustments, that's one way. But the other way is to target the fossil fuels that are located in tropical rainforests and areas of high biodiversity. So they're the resources that you really want to keep in the ground. An example is Ecuador, the Yasuni National Park, all through the Amazon, through the Congo rainforest in Africa, as examples. Politics and inflation. Most people, when they think about this policy, one of the things that they first comment on is, is it politically feasible? Because, you could come up with lots of reasons to question it. One reason is inflation. If you're increasing the money supply through central banks, you are increasing the money supply, so that implies you're creating monetary inflation. So that's one of the things that most people identify as a potential problem. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but there are advantages of this policy. The major advantage I see for countries is that it overcomes the free rider problem, which is the idea that governments, countries, generally don't want to be the leader of the pack doing the most decarbonisation. Why? Because it costs. And why would, let's say, Germany or Australia spend an enormous amount of money on decarbonisation if the rest of the world is not keeping up? And there's resistance because of the cost. So here, what we're doing with this policy is we're taking the cost out of the fiscal accounts of government. No person, no corporate, no government is going to be directly charged or taxed. And that's got to be politically useful. No direct taxes. We're funding it with the carbon quantitative easing as the guarantee, and that creates more fiscal space for governments. It's funded through capital reallocation as the currency is traded, and the cost sharing is managed with uniform monetary inflation whenever the central banks are printing more money. The technical points, we could discuss that if it's confusing, but the challenges are that it doesn't really matter what we do policy-wise. If we're going to decarbonise quickly, it's going to cost, and that means some periods of monetary inflation in this policy and an increase in investing in clean energy that will crowd out consumption. So what that means is the cost of all of this clean energy and decarbonising industry is so high that it means there will be less money available for producing and consuming stuff that maybe we don't need, or maybe things we do want or need, but that's a sacrifice. So how do we implement? Okay, in this policy, as I said, we've developed the policy and we want to raise some money and support to demonstrate, and that will take 2 or 3 years. And we figure it's going to cost about 10 million to do it well. We'll do economic assessments. We'll focus on expert interviews. So we'll get all the experts from around the world and interview them on video. And then we will do role-playing with stakeholders, meaning we'll find corporates that have a lot of pollution and we'll role-play the policy with their executives, doing spreadsheet scenarios to see what they think. Because if they like the policy, then that's a good sign. Once that's done, or while we're doing that, we think we can attract a few countries to do the pilot, and then as they do the pilot, it will create a wave of interest around the world until eventually it could go to the UN for a major agreement. So very roughly, that's the idea, without going into all these details. Up here on the top right, that's actually, looks like an oil field in Ecuador, the Usuni National Park. And that's a big story because they wanted to sell their oil to the world in a way that would allow them not to drill. I know that might sound strange, but they realized that they needed the revenue, but they didn't really want to extract the oil and gas because it would harm the national park, the biodiversity, and the indigenous people. So they advertised to the world, they requested the world to pay them to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, but there was little interest. So they weren't able to stop the oil and gas drilling. They decided to have a referendum, a vote, for the people to decide if they were going to extract it or not. And the vote turned out to favour leaving it in the ground. So under their political voting scheme, they're supposed to leave the fossil fuels in the ground to protect the Usuni National Park. But as it turns out, even though they had the vote, they can't stop it because the money interest is too strong. Because you've got to keep in mind, Ecuador is not a wealthy country, and they can't stop it because they need the money. So that would be an excellent example of how we could demonstrate this policy. This is the last section, and I thought I'd throw it in because I really like systems thinking, and I just want to see how you react. And I promise this will go quickly, okay? Because I've been talking for quite a while. So I wanted to show you the steady state economy. If you're interested in economics, especially for sustainability, there's this concept called the steady state economy, which came out of Herman Daly's work. And it's very similar to the circular economy. Basically, it says if this is our civilization inside the Earth system, that it consumes materials, resources, including energy, and then waste comes out. And the idea is that to become sustainable, we take the waste and recycle as much as we can. This is an idea which has gained quite a lot of interest. It's controversial though, because there don't appear to be any policies that can actually deliver this in an easy and convenient way, and not at the global level. The other idea that sort of comes along with this is that we've got to degrow the whole thing. If this system is too big for the planet, you've got to shrink it down. That's called degrowth. I'm not saying this is entirely wrong. I'm not critiquing it for every resource. But what I'm saying is that model isn't sophisticated enough to deal with carbon. Because my argument is that carbon operates on a different system, where, like in the natural world, you have carbon being pulled out of the atmosphere by plants through photosynthesis. It's driven by solar energy and DNA, and then sugars produced by plants are feeding the rest of the biosphere for respiration, and puts the CO2 back in the atmosphere, of course. So we know that. And I did my own analysis, which hasn't been published, but I argue that a key feature of life is that all these systems, the animals, the fungi, the plants, they're locked into a certain metabolic pathway because of their DNA. And this is a feature of life and complexity. And so for this reason, I argue that, it's a very brief version of the theory, but I argue that our civilization is actually quite similar in that we can't actually get our civilization to come to net zero without specializing. We need another sector. Here I call it the new mitigative economy, but maybe we should call it the new mitigation sector. And it will be specialised for carbon dioxide removal and decarbonising conventionally. And so in this new model, what I'm saying is we've got to view civilization as two systems that complement each other, and they're specialised. It's like they have their own DNA. And if you use the analogy of DNA, the DNA, in a sense, is provided by the currencies that are being used. So here, this system is going to be structured around the carbon currency, which, by the way, remember, you can't use it to buy stuff. It's just a financial asset. And if you look at the energy balance, you have energy coming in. It can be fossil fuels, it can be solar, wind, nuclear. Some of that energy is going to be transferred across, and this system can also take clean energy from the environment. And this is the new model, which I think can work. So thank you. That's my presentation.